Usually when modern readers talk about finding a biblical basis for something, there is this implicit expectation of a scavenger hunt.
Oh, totally.
Like it is treated almost like panning for gold.
Right.
You sift through the pages, you find that one gleaming nugget, a specific verse, or a direct imperative command.
Yeah, and then you point to it and declare, there it is. That is the foundational reason we do what we do.
Exactly. It's a clean, manageable approach. You just isolate a verse, put it on a coffee mug, and build an entire ministry strategy around it.
Right.
But when you step into the world of early church history and deep canonical mechanics, that neat little scavenger hunt approach just completely disintegrates.
It really does. And that disintegration is exactly where we landed in our prior deep dive. We spent a considerable amount of time unpacking the profound theological breakthrough and the subsequent historical resolution of the early church.
Right.
Because those early believers did not simply stumble forward in the dark, reacting blindly to Roman persecution. They actually established a firm grasp on God's redemptive timeline. They figured out precisely where they were located in the grand, sweeping narrative of history.
Yes, and that historical location dictated their entire posture toward the world around them.
Exactly.
And that timeline remains our definitive anchor today.
Yeah.
I mean, everything we are going to explore in this session, both historically and textually, is anchored in the reality we established in our prolegomena.
Right.
Which is that the Missio Dei is the central driving narrative of all Scripture and of all human history. We are operating entirely from that baseline.
Which is such a crucial anchor.
It is. So to push this forward today, we are synthesizing Christopher J.H. Wright's deep canonical mechanics from the first 2 chapters of his book, The Mission of God.
Excellent text.
With the raw, deeply human biographical history of the early church, found in Ruth A. Tucker's As, From Jerusalem to Irian-Jaya, specifically focusing on her first lesson.
Yeah, and synthesizing Wright's theological engine with Tucker's historical biographies brings us face to face with the proof texting trap. Oh, yes.
Because historically, the early believers did not march into the Roman Empire carrying isolated verses in their pockets.
No, they didn't.
They weren't leaning on Matthew 28's Great Commission as a standalone command to justify their existence. They inhabited a grand narrative. And inhabiting that comprehensive narrative forced them to completely reinterpret the entire sociopolitical structure of the Roman Empire around them.
That's such a great way to frame it. And Wright really forces us to invert our traditional thinking here. He argues we must move away from looking for a biblical basis for mission and instead recognize the missional basis of the Bible.
Right, which is a massive paradigm shift.
Huge shift, because if you are merely looking for a biblical basis for mission, you are inherently treating mission as one of 100 different distinct topics the Bible happens to address.
Like marriage or finances or dietary laws? Exactly.
Yeah.
You find a few verses, construct a localized doctrine, and you move on. But recognizing the missional basis of the Bible means the canon itself, the very existence of these texts, is a product of God's self-giving movement toward creation.
Wow. Yeah.
The Scriptures are a multi-voiced global collection of texts produced in the crucible of cross-cultural tension. They were written by people on the move, actively participating in what God was doing in the world.
And the language of the New Testament is the ultimate historical proof of that cross-cultural tension.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the texts were not written in classical elevated Greek, right? The language of the elite academies or the philosophers.
Right. They weren't trying to sound academically polished.
No, they were written in Koine Greek, the language of the marketplace, the docks, the streets. It was the lingua franca of the Greco-Roman world. The gospel fundamentally refused to stay locked in its original cultural or linguistic container.
And you can see that so clearly when you look at the linguistic journey of the Aramaic phrase Maranatha.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Right. Our Lord, come. This was a deeply established liturgical part of the worship for the original Aramaic-speaking followers of Jesus. But as the gospel moved across cultural lines, as it aggressively penetrated the Koine Greek world, the early believers didn't just transliterate the Aramaic into Greek characters.
Right. They engaged in profound cultural translation.
Exactly. They utilized the Greek word kyrios for Lord.
And they were pulling from a very specific linguistic well when they chose kyrios.
Yes, they were.
Because the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, completed centuries before Jesus had already laid that groundwork. When those Jewish scholars translating the Hebrew text in Alexandria came across the divine covenant name Yahweh, They faced a massive translational dilemma.
What do you do with that name, right?
Exactly, and they chose not to transliterate it. Instead, they used the Greek phrase ho Kyrios, the Lord. They employed that specific term over 1,600 times to render the name of the God of Israel.
Over 1,600 times. So when a first-century Greek-speaking Jew or, a newly converted Gentile heard the word Kyrios, their minds didn't go to a local magistrate or some minor regional deity.
No, not at all.
They were being pointed directly toward the sovereign God of the cosmos. So when early Christians took the fully freighted theological identity of the Old Testament God, Yahweh, and directly transferred it onto Jesus of Nazareth, using that identical word, Kyrios, they were making a staggering canonical claim.
It's explosive.
It really is. Look at the Christ hymn in Philippians 2:6-11. The text applies the most fiercely guarded monotheistic concepts of the Old Testament directly to a crucified Galilean carpenter.
Right.
It claims that Jesus operates in the exact same frame of reference, with the same exclusive cosmic claims as Yahweh himself. I mean, every knee bowing and every tongue confessing is a direct pull from Isaiah 45, where Yahweh swears by himself that to him alone every knee will bow.
Yeah, which shifts our entire understanding of biblical authority. If the Bible is the living product of this explosive outward movement, its authority cannot function as a simple list of localized rules.
No, it can't. And Wright frames this through the lens of teleological monotheism.
Right.
He says, biblical authority is rooted in three active, interlocking realities. First, the reality of God. We are dealing with Yahweh, a specific, named, biographied God who acts decisively in human history, governed by his steadfast love, his hesed.
Beautifully said.
This is not the unmoved mover of Greek philosophy, right? Second, authority is rooted in the reality of the story. The biblical narrative provides the definitive answer to the foundational worldview questions like, where are we and who are we?
Right, the grand narrative.
Exactly. We exist in a world created by Yahweh, and we are humanity created in his image, fractured but being redeemed. And then third, authority is rooted in the reality of the people. God elected a specific people to serve as the vehicle of his redemptive purpose for all nations, the ethne.
Okay, I am going to push back on this framework a little bit because it feels precariously open-ended.
Okay, go for it.
I understand the theology of teleological monotheism. I grasp the concept of the reality of the story. But practically speaking, how does this abstract reality govern the actual ethics of the early church on a random Tuesday in a pagan Roman city?
Right.
If God is writing a grand, infallible narrative, why didn't he just provide a clear, static municipal code for the church? Leaving ethical decisions like whether a believer can eat meat offered to a pagan idol in the marketplace up to normal people trying to inhabit a story seems incredibly risky and highly prone to heresy.
It is undeniably risky. But a static municipal code cannot survive cross-cultural transmission.
Oh, that's a good point.
A rigid rule book is inherently tied to the cultural context in which it was written. If God provided a static municipal code tailored to first-century agrarian Palestine, it would be utterly useless to a 21st-century digital economy.
Right, yeah.
Instead of a rule book, think of biblical authority as a sprawling river delta. The canon is a complex, messy mixture of smaller narratives, different literary genres, specific localized laws, poetry, and pastoral letters. But all of these distinct streams are flowing inexorably toward a single, massive ocean, God's redemptive purpose for all creation.
And that's a great image.
So when the early church faced an unprecedented ethical dilemma, like navigating the socioeconomic realities of meat offered to idols in Corinth, they rarely had a direct pre-written command.
Right.
Instead, they asked, which way is the river flowing? They applied their theology of creation, that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and the reality of Yahweh, to the pagan marketplace. They deduced their ethics by knowing whose story they were inside of and what the ultimate trajectory of that story was.
And seeing how that theological framework translated into the actual gritty reality of the first-century Roman world brings us directly into the historical biographies provided by Tucker.
Yes, the lived reality of it.
Exactly. We get to watch how this specific hermeneutic played out on the ground, in the dirt, and very often in the blood of the early believers. Paul of Tarsus is the prime example here.
Oh, completely.
The modern church often views Paul as a triumphant superhero of the faith, marching across the Mediterranean basin, planting thriving megachurches, and authoring half the New Testament with complete invulnerability.
Right, the untouchable saint.
But the actual historical record presents a man engaged in a relentless campaign of downward mobility.
Yeah, Michael Duncan refers to this as Paul's theology of failure.
Ouch.
Paul deliberately stepped down the social and religious ladder to reach the masses. His ministry was not a pristine, uninterrupted series of evangelistic victories. It grew out of the fertile but painful soil of ruptured relationships.
Right, like with Barnabas.
Exactly. The bitter split with Barnabas over John Mark was a massive public interpersonal failure between two foundational leaders. Paul's timeline is marked by agonizing theological debates with the Judaizers, violent citywide riots, extended periods rotting in Roman prisons, and literal physical beatings that left him permanently scarred.
In Paul's theology of mission, his operative, hermeneutic, was forged precisely in that friction. His epistles are not abstract dogmatics written in an ivory tower. They are emergency pastoral responses dispatched by a missionary who is actively suffering for the ethne.
Yes.
And that suffering naturally culminated in the ultimate loss of earthly status. In the early church, martyrdom was not an unfortunate accidental byproduct of the mission. It was the apex of the mission itself.
Wow.
The Greek word martyria literally translates to witness. The testimony these believers displayed in their everyday lives was irrevocably sealed in their deaths.
It was the ultimate inescapable proof to the surrounding pagan world that the Christian faith was anchored in a reality vastly superior to the Roman Empire.
It really was. Just look closely at the martyrdom of Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, in the middle of the 2nd century.
Oh, that story's so powerful.
He was an old man, well into his 80s. The Roman authorities were not bloodthirsty monsters looking for an excuse to execute a senior citizen. The proconsul practically begged him to just go through the motions.
Right.
The Roman civic mindset viewed religion differently than we do today. Burning a pinch of incense to the genius of the emperor was not necessarily a deep spiritual compromise to them. It was a basic civic duty.
Like paying taxes or something.
Exactly. It was the ancient equivalent of saluting the flag or pledging allegiance to the state. The proconsul pleaded, "What harm is there in saying Caesar is Lord and offering a little incense? Just swear by the divinity of Caesar and I will let you go."
Because to the Roman mind, it was a microscopic political compromise for the sake of public order. But Polycarp refused the logic of the empire. He replied, "For 86 years I have been his servant, and he has never done me wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me?" And for that, he was burned at the stake.
Incredible.
And connecting this back to Wright's canonical mechanics, we see the ultimate real-world application of teleological monotheism. Polycarp was not just being a religiously stubborn old man. He stood firm because he was entirely inhabiting the script of Yahweh.
Yes.
To say Caesar is Lord would be to step out of God's story and validate a counterfeit, idolatrous narrative. By refusing, Polycarp was making a deeply treasonous political claim. He was saying a crucified Jewish carpenter held higher cosmic authority than the emperor of Rome. The friction of those two worldviews colliding is what ignited the pyre.
And while Polycarp's story is deeply inspiring, we must examine the messy, fragile reality of the broader historical record.
Yeah, it wasn't all heroes.
No. We celebrate the heroes who stood firm, but a vast number of early believers did not. Pliny the Younger's correspondence with Emperor Trajan around 112 AD in the province of Bithynia strips away any romanticized view of the early church.
That letter is chilling.
It really is. Pliny outlined his administrative strategy for interrogating accused Christians. He threatened them with execution, and if they stubbornly persisted, he followed through. But Pliny happily reported back to Trajan that his methods were working beautifully because a significant number of Christians were caving under the pressure.
Yeah.
When faced with the blade, they denied their faith, offered incense to the emperor's image, actively cursed the name of Christ, and returned to the pagan temples. The reality on the ground was incredibly fragile. The church was bleeding members who simply could not withstand the terror of the state.
This forces us to confront the reality of human frailty within God's mission. The narrative of the Missio Dei does not erase human weakness, it actively encompasses it. Even when localized believers failed spectacularly, even when entire congregations buckled under imperial pressure, the overarching mission of God continued to press forward.
And it pressed forward through individuals who endured agonizing emotional and relational friction.
Oh, the relational cost was massive.
The Diary of Perpetua, a 22-year-old noblewoman in Carthage, North Africa in the early 3rd century, captures this perfectly.
Yeah.
She was a nursing mother of an infant son arrested for her faith. The surviving text of her prison diary reveals that her primary agony was not the impending physical violence of the gladiator arena.
Wait, was it?
The true torture was deeply relational. Her father, a respected Roman nobleman, was humiliated and terrified by her arrest. He visited her in prison, not to comfort her, but to beg her, threaten her, and physically assault her, desperate for her to renounce her faith and save the family's honor.
The friction of a father pleading for his daughter's life, using every ounce of emotional leverage he possesses, I mean, that is just devastating.
It is. And then there is the reality of her infant son. Perpetua wrote with raw vulnerability about the physical pain of her milk coming in while separated from her starving baby.
Oh, wow.
She recorded the immense relief when the guards briefly allowed her to nurse him in the dungeon, but the climax of her diary is the devastating intentional choice to ultimately surrender her child to the care of her family so she could face martyrdom rather than deny Christ.
Just giving up her baby.
She gave up her baby. It is a level of commitment that deeply offends our modern sensibilities. It feels almost inhuman.
It feels inhuman until you realize she knew exactly which story was ultimate.
Yes.
Her identity as an active participant in God's redemptive mission superseded every other identity she held. It superseded her identity as a dutiful Roman daughter, and it even superseded her identity as a human mother.
Which is hard to even fathom.
It is, but she understood that denying Christ to raise her son would mean raising him in a counterfeit narrative. This is the stunning, sobering reality of what it means to be fully formed by a missional hermeneutic.
And while Perpetua was shedding her blood in the highly structured urban centers of the Roman Empire, a completely different, almost invisible missional strategy was having to be invented out in the untamed frontiers.
Right, outside the empire.
Because the mission did not just survive localized urban persecution, it actively translated itself into entirely new cultural forms at the edges of the known world.
Which is where the shift from looking for a biblical basis for mission to recognizing the missional basis of the Bible becomes incredibly practical, especially when dealing with frontier translation.
Exactly. Ulfilas, a missionary to the Goths in the 4th century, illustrates this perfectly. He did not simply travel north to preach Greek sermons to barbarian tribes. He recognized they needed the scriptures in their own tongue.
But they didn't even have an alphabet, right?
Right. The Goths did not possess a written language. So Ulfilas undertook the monumental task of inventing the Gothic alphabet specifically to translate the Bible for them.
That's incredible.
But his most brilliant and highly controversial editorial decision occurred during the translation process. When translating the Old Testament, Ulfilas intentionally omitted the books of Kings.
Wait, he completely excised a canonical text.
He left them out entirely.
Wow.
The Goths were already a fiercely warlike tribal people whose culture revolved around violence and conquest. Ulfilas knew that if he handed them detailed canonical accounts of holy war, of Israelite kings ruthlessly conquering their tribal enemies, the Goths would weaponize the text.
Right, they would just see it as justification.
It would pour theological gasoline on their existing violent cultural tendencies. So, he engaged in aggressive cultural translation to protect the broader trajectory of the gospel.
Evaluating Ulfilas through Wright's canonical lens reveals a profound theological truth here.
What's that?
The very act of translating Scripture into new tongues, and going so far as to invent alphabets to accomplish it, proves that no single language holds a monopoly on God's revelation. Greek is not a holy language. Latin is not a holy language. The script of Yahweh can, and absolutely must, inhabit the language of the ethne. Furthermore, Ulfilas' editorial choice to withhold the books of Kings demonstrates a pastoral hermeneutic in action.
Yeah, that makes sense.
He was shepherding a specific people toward the larger trajectory of God's redemptive river delta.
Yeah.
He was actively preventing them from getting caught in a destructive eddy of their own cultural violence.
Now, contrast that highly localized, culturally sensitive approach of Ulfilas with the structural shift factors that occurred later in Europe.
Okay.
You have the rise of Celtic monasticism, with figures like Patrick, who returned to Ireland as a former slave to evangelize his captors, and later Columba on the island of Iona. The Celtic missiological approach was entirely holistic and decentralized.
They weren't coming as conquerors.
No, they did not arrive with invading armies or demands for immediate political assimilation. They established community mission centers focused on agriculture, copying manuscripts, daily prayer, and shared living. They lived among the pagan tribes and won them over through a patient, lived-in faith.
They essentially establish an alternative reality, a visible manifestation of God's story right in the midst of pagan Europe.
Beautifully put. But that decentralized approach stands in stark contrast to the later top-down methodology of Charlemagne, the king of the Franks.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Charlemagne massively extended the geographical boundaries of nominal Christianity across Europe, but he accomplished it by freely mixing missiology with military might. It was coercive political expansion. He offered conquered tribes a brutal binary choice: baptism by the sword or immediate execution.
Which is just Charlemagne's methodology represents the complete collapse of a missional hermeneutic. He violently replaced the reality of God's story with the reality of his own political empire. He attempted to force the sprawling river delta of God's redemptive purpose into a rigid, man-made canal designed solely to serve Frankish imperial interests.
And bringing the deep canonical theology of Wright and the bloody, complex history of Tucker into the modern pastoral context requires serious reflection.
It really does.
Because how does a pastor or an MDiv student utilize this historical friction on a Tuesday afternoon in local ministry?
Right, because knowledge that remains theoretical is practically useless. We must apply this directly to specific pastoral scenarios. Consider modern preaching strategies, for instance. If a pastor truly accepts Wright's premise regarding the canonical mechanics of the Bible, they must actively move their congregations away from traditional proof texting. Pastors must take away the comforting, isolated coffee mug verses and replace them with the weight of the entire narrative. When preaching the cross, it cannot merely be presented as a private transactional mechanism for personal salvation.
Like a simple formula to get an individual soul into heaven.
Exactly. The cross must be preached as the unavoidable climactic cost of God's global mission to redeem the entire cosmos. Preaching must constantly locate the modern listener within that grand, ongoing narrative.
And let's move from the pulpit to the administrative boardroom. Consider the theology behind a local church budget.
Oh, this is where it gets real.
It does, because nothing reveals a congregation's true, functional hermeneutic faster than its spreadsheet.
Wow, yeah.
A church budget operates as a highly accurate theological document. Does the budget reflect an ecclesiocentric view? Meaning, does the church view itself as the center of the story, resulting in the vast majority of financial resources being poured into internal comforts, aesthetic building upgrades, and retaining consumer-minded congregants?
The traps so many fall into.
Exactly. Or does the budget reflect a theocentric view? Does the church understand that it only exists for God's mission to the ethne and allocate its resources accordingly?
If the local church is fundamentally a product of the Missio Dei, then its financial resources intrinsically belong to that mission. Withholding those resources for internal luxury is a failure to inhabit the story.
Period.
What about cross-cultural partnerships? I mean, modern churches are increasingly interacting with global communities, local diaspora groups, and international partners.
Right.
Ministry leaders must learn the humility of Ulphilas. How do we practice true cultural translation without compromising the text? It requires recognizing that our specific Western cultural expression of Christianity is not the universal canonical standard. We must translate the core reality of Yahweh without demanding that other cultures adopt our cultural trappings.
And we must desperately avoid the coercive traps of Charlemagne.
Yes.
Modern Western churches wield immense financial wealth and institutional power. It is incredibly easy to use that leverage to force international partners into a Western mold. Tying ministry funding to total administrative assimilation is just a modernized, sanitized version of baptism by the sword. Charlemagne successfully built an empire, but in doing so, he deeply compromised the church.
I want to address the psychological burden of ministry directly here, too.
Okay, let's go there.
We have discussed the grand, sweeping narrative of history and the ultimate victory of God's redemptive mission. But on a random Tuesday afternoon, a significant number of ministry leaders are staring at stagnant church growth, crushing budget deficits, and absolute personal exhaustion.
The reality of the trenches.
Exactly. How do pastors and MDiv students deal with the acute pain of failure when a church plant dies or a community refuses to respond?
The reality of localized failure is exactly where the historical comfort of our sources becomes vital. We look back at Paul's theology of failure. We remember his seemingly wasted years in the wilderness of Arabia, the deeply painful rupture of his partnership with Barnabas, and the years he spent rotting in Roman prisons when he desperately wanted to be out planting churches. We look at the terrifying fragility of the church in Bithynia, where believers caved under Pliny's interrogations. Localized ministry has always been incredibly messy and deeply discouraging.
Yeah.
But the theological comfort is that the overarching narrative of Yahweh is entirely secure, even when Tuesday afternoon ministry feels like an unmitigated disaster. God's mission does not depend on our uninterrupted success. It operates through, and very often in spite of, our human frailty.
Synthesizing the core lessons from today's textual and historical exploration, we arrive at the undeniable reality that the Bible is not a static reference book containing a few scattered commands about mission.
Not at all.
It is the living, breathing product of God's relentless movement toward creation. It is the definitive record of Yahweh acting in history, governed by his steadfast love, culminating in the ultimate translation of his very presence into human history through the incarnation of Jesus.
And from the historical side, the definitive takeaway is that the early church did not conquer the Roman Empire through political dominance, coercive leverage, or slick evangelistic strategies. They won the world through a deeply messy, frequently agonizing spirituality. They utilized aggressive cultural translation, they embraced downward mobility, and they offered a faithful, unflinching witness martyria even unto death. They outloved, outsuffered, and outdied the pagan world around them because they knew exactly which story they were inhabiting.
They inhabited the script of Yahweh.
And that historical reality brings us to the threshold of our next deep dive.
I'm looking forward to this.
Next time, we are going to explore the exact missiological tension that arose when the church shifted out of antiquity and into the Middle Ages. We will analyze the rise of Roman Catholic monastic missions, the deep theological complexities and moral compromises of mass tribal conversions under figures like Boniface and Charlemagne.
It's going to be intense.
It is. And then the incredible dawn of the Moravian advance, where Protestant missions finally began to awaken from their localized slumber. It is a turbulent, highly complex era of history that continues to define modern global mission strategies.
Well, as we close today's session, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Okay.
We have seen how the early church stood firm against imperial pressure, translated the biblical text into the languages of the ethne, and faced the lions because they view their everyday lives as active participation in the sprawling river delta of God's redemptive story. Look closely at your own ministry context, your own budget, and your own preaching. What specific script is your local congregation inhabiting right now? And who wrote it?